Amen.
At sunrise, the sound of church bells rings through a sleepy town. When the parish doors finally open, every member of the choir is found seated in their pews, lifeless, hymnals open to the same page. No wounds, no signs of struggle, just silence. In the tight-knit town of Ashbrook, the choir of St. Augustine's church becomes the center of a chilling enigma when 17 singers are discovered dead in perfect formation. Detective Rowan Briggs, a brooding investigator with a past scarred by faith, is called in. The case begins as a possible mass poisoning, but unravels into something far more sinister. A secret society hidden in plain sight, a hymn older than the church itself, and a ledger of names that predicts who dies next. With the clock ticking and bodies piling up, Rowan must confront his own demons while peeling back layers of devotion, deception, and death. Before we get into the case file, just a quick note. If stories of hidden motives, dead ends, and unexpected turns are your thing, make sure you're subscribed. Hit the bell so the next mystery finds you first. Now, let's open the file. Ashbrook wasn't a town that made headlines. The kind of place where Sunday services filled more pews than Friday night bars. Where the biggest scandal in recent memory was a bake sale running out of pies. That was before St. Augustine's church became a tomb. Detective Rowan Briggs pulled his unmarked sedan up to the edge of the police barricade, tires crunching over gravel dust. The morning fog still hugged the streets like a shroud, and the sharp tolling of church bells cut through it, relentless and mocking. He stepped out, coffee in one hand, badge in the other. The officer on perimeter duty stiffened when he saw Rowan's face. Everyone in the department knew him, knew the stories. "Detective," the officer said, lifting the tape. "You're going to want to see this." Inside, the church smelled like candle wax and something sweeter, cloying, almost metallic. Rowan froze halfway down the aisle. 17 people, sitting upright in the pews, hands folded neatly in their laps, eyes open, every face serene, like they were mid-prayer except for the silence. There should have been murmurs, shuffling, life. Instead, the air was heavy with absence. Their hymnals were open, each to the same page. Hymn 237, the last Amen. The victims weren't random. He recognized a few faces from town, the florist, the butcher's wife, even the mayor's sister. All dead, no blood, no visible wounds. But one detail made his skin crawl. Their mouths were open, just slightly, as if the final note had been cut short. Rowan's eyes flicked to the altar. The crucifix towered above him, its wooden Christ casting a long shadow. And beneath it, scrawled in red wax on the marble floor, were 3 words. Hear the silence. Rowan exhaled slowly, the weight of the case settling on his shoulders. Whatever happened here, it wasn't just murder. It was a message. And the choir had just sung their last hymn. The crime scene stretched well into the afternoon, though the sunlight filtering through St. Augustine's stained glass windows offered no warmth. Instead, the fragmented colors painted the bodies in ghostly reds and greens, like silent actors frozen in a grotesque tableau. Detective Rowan Briggs stood near the altar, gloves on, crouching over the message scrawled in red wax. Hear the silence. The words clung stubbornly to the marble floor, as if mocking every theory forming in his mind. Behind him, CSU techs photographed every angle. The low hum of evidence vacuums filled the cavernous church, a sound almost reverent in its persistence. Rowan. He turned to find Detective Lila Marino stepping carefully between pews. Her sharp bob framed a face that rarely betrayed emotion, but her eyes today carried the weight of something unspoken. "They weren't poisoned," she said without preamble, glancing at the coroner's preliminary report in her hand. "At least not by anything obvious. No signs of trauma, no needle marks." Talk screen still pending, but she hesitated, lowering her voice. Their lungs were empty. Rowan frowned. Empty?
Finish it.
Collapsed, like the air was sucked right out of them. A chill traced his spine. So, suffocation? Not exactly. No bruising on the mouth or throat. No blockage. It's like... They exhaled and never inhaled again. Rowan glanced toward the pews, toward those slightly parted lips frozen mid-hymn. The image gnawed at him. What about the books? He asked finally, nodding toward the hymnals. Lila stepped aside as a tech carried over the evidence bag. Inside, hymn 237 sat stark and accusing. The last Amen. Rowan flipped it open carefully, scanning the verses written in faded ink. The melody lines crawled across the page like something alive, and below them, the lyrics. Let silence fall upon the choir. Let breath depart. Let none aspire. For in the hush, his voice is near. The last Amen shall draw him here. Rowan felt the weight of the words settle in his chest. This wasn't just a hymn. It was something else. He glanced at the publication date, printed at the bottom of the page. 1893. But the hymnals in this church were supposedly modern prints, no older than the 1970s. Leela, he said slowly, get me the church records. I want to know when these books came in and who brought them. Before she could reply, a CSU tech called out from the organ loft above. Detective, you're going to want to see this. Rowan and Lila exchanged a look, then climbed the narrow wooden stairs, their footsteps echoing like hollow heartbeats. The organ loft was dim, dust motes swirling in the pale shafts of light from the stained glass. And there, behind the pipes, lay a compartment recently opened. Inside was a small wooden box lined with velvet, and in it, a cassette tape, no label. Just a strip of white adhesive marked with 2 words in spidery handwriting. Play me. Rowan's gut tightened. He glanced at Lila. Get this to the lab, he said, his voice low. And find me a working tape deck. Because whatever was on that tape might not just explain what happened here. It might be the next verse in a song that kills. The evidence bag sat on the dashboard like a silent passenger, the cassette tape inside it catching slivers of sunlight as Rowan drove back to the precinct. His thoughts churned like the tires on the wet asphalt. 17 people dead, lungs empty, hymnals open to a hymn that read like a curse. And now, a tape that simply said, play me. He didn't like puzzles that taunted him. The wipers thudded a slow rhythm against the windshield as the church receded in the rearview mirror. Rowan had been in homicide long enough to know when something was off, and everything about this case screamed wrong. When he walked into the precinct, the hum of phones and chatter did nothing to drown out the weight in his chest. Lila was already there, perched at her desk, flipping through a stack of papers. She looked up when he approached. Church records? Rowan asked. More like church secrets, she replied, sliding a folder toward him. You're gonna love this. He opened it. The roster of the St. Augustine choir stared back at him. 17 names. Every victim accounted for except one. Ethan Cole. Cole didn't show, Rowan murmured, tapping the name. Was he scheduled? Every Sunday, without fail, Lila said. And get this, he's not answering his phone, and his apartment door was locked from the outside when we sent a unit. No sign of him. Rowan's jaw tightened. So either he skipped the massacre, or... He made it happen, Lila finished grimly. Rowan closed the file, already moving toward his office. Find everything you can on Cole, where he works, who he talks to, where he learned to sing. And Lila, he paused in the doorway. Check if he's ever been arrested before, even for something small. Lila nodded, already typing. Inside his office, Rowan set the evidence bag on the desk and stared at the tape. Something about it gnawed at him, an old medium for an old song. He picked up the receiver, calling the audio lab. Walker, I need a deck that can play a cassette. And I need it now. The line crackled. You're in luck, Detective. I've got a dinosaur in the back. Bring the tape. Rowan grabbed his coat. But just as he stepped out, Lila's voice stopped him. Rowan, she said quietly, eyes glued to her monitor. You should see this. He walked back, and what he saw made his blood run cold. On the screen was a scanned obituary. Daniel Price, choir director, St. Augustine's, died 1978. That's not unusual, Rowan said slowly. It's an old choir. Keep reading, Lila whispered. The obituary mentioned something odd. Mr. Price was survived by his nephew, Ethan Cole, who inherits his uncle's belongings, including his extensive collection of recorded hymns. Rowan stared at the screen. The pieces started falling into place like jagged shards. Ethan Cole wasn't just a missing choir member. He was the bloodline of the man who once led that same choir, a man who apparently left behind a collection of tapes. Find out what Price was recording, Rowan said, his voice tight, and where those tapes are now. But before Lila could answer, Rowan's phone buzzed. A text message flashed on the screen. Unknown number. Detective Briggs, you shouldn't have opened the box. Now you have to finish the hymn. Rowan's grip tightened on the phone until his knuckles went white. Someone was watching, and they wanted him to sing. The precinct's walls felt like they were closing in, the low hum of conversation suffocating Rowan as the text burned in his mind. You shouldn't have opened the box. Now you have to finish the hymn. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. Whoever sent that message already knew where he was and what he had. By the time Rowan and Lila pulled back into St. Augustine's, the late afternoon sun had dipped low, turning the church into a silhouette of spires against a blood-red sky. The police tape still fluttered like warning banners across the doors. Walker's running the tape now, Lila said as they climbed the steps. Should have an update within the hour. Rowan nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. The message, the hymn, the tape, and Ethan Cole still missing. Inside, the church was eerily silent, the morning's chaos replaced by an oppressive stillness that made the hairs on the back of Rowan's neck stand up. Their footsteps echoed across the polished floor as they headed toward the loft. The tech who had discovered the hidden compartment earlier was gone, but the organ pipes loomed like a wall of silver giants, their hollow mouths gaping. Rowan crouched beside the compartment, shining his flashlight deeper this time. Something glimmered inside the cavity, just beyond reach. He slid on gloves, fished his hand in, and pulled out a brittle roll of parchment tied with crimson ribbon. Dust puffed into the air like ancient breath as he unrolled it across the altar. It wasn't sheet music. Not exactly. The paper held musical notations intertwined with strange symbol circles, crosses, and a script that didn't look like any language Rowan recognized. And at the top, in bold black ink, Dominus Tacet. Latin? Latin? Lila guessed, leaning closer. Yeah, Rowan muttered. The Lord is silent. The notes seemed wrong, like they weren't meant for a melody humans could sing. But the lyrics scribbled beneath them froze Rowan's blood. When voices fall to sacred hush, and hearts no longer beat the rush, the door shall open, shadows claim, the hymn complete in death and name. This isn't a hymn, Lila said quietly. It's a ritual. Before Rowan could respond, a sound shivered through the empty church soft, almost delicate at first, like fingers brushing ivory keys. They both turned toward the organ loft. The organ was playing. A slow, haunting tune drifted down from the pipes, curling through the silence like smoke. Notes that didn't belong to any hymn Rowan knew. And then his phone buzzed again. Same unknown number. Verse 2 begins, "Are you listening?" Rowan's pulse pounded in his ears as the last note hung in the air and faded. The church fell silent once more. But this time, it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind that waits. And something told Rowan that if they didn't find Ethan Cole soon, there would be another choir singing their last amen. The organ's last note still lingered in Rowan's bones, long after it faded into silence. He stood motionless, the faint scent of dust and candle wax clinging to the air, until the sound of Lila's voice cut through. "Rowan!" He turned to find her holding something, a folded slip of paper she must have picked up near the side aisle. The edges were creased, the paper yellowed like it had been sitting in the dark for years. "Where was that?" he asked. "In the confessional," she said, her voice tight. The door was cracked open. This was on the seat. Rowan took it from her carefully, his gloved fingers brushing the rough paper as he unfolded it. The handwriting was jagged, hurried black ink biting into the fibers. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." The hymn was only the beginning. The silence opens the door. Find the names before the final verse is sung. One will break the hush. One will lead you to me. No signature. No time stamp. Rowan stared at it, jaw tightening. Whoever wrote this wasn't just confessing. They were taunting him. Lila read over his shoulder. "Find the names." "What names?" He looked back at the parchment they'd pulled from the organ loft, the strange symbols spiraling around musical notes like vines. Could those markings represent people? Victims? Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. Again. Same number. Same chill. "You're late for confession, Detective." Rowan's pulse kicked. He glanced at the booth, a narrow wooden box drenched in shadows, its curtain fluttering slightly, though the air was still. He approached, every instinct screaming at him to keep his gun drawn, but instead he pushed the curtain aside. The seat was empty. But on the kneeler, etched into the wood, was a fresh carving. Verse 3. Rowan exhaled slowly. Whoever was doing this had been inside the church recently, maybe minutes ago, close enough to watch him without being seen. "Rowan." Lila's voice had gone cold. She held up her phone, showing him the image on the screen. A photo of the two of them, standing in the very spot they were now. The caption read, "Silence is breaking." Rowan scanned the nave, his senses on high alert, but the church was empty or looked that way. Shadows clung to corners, and the fading light from the stained glass made the air feel fractured, like reality was splitting at the seams. He tightened his grip on the note. The killer wasn't just watching. They were choreographing this like a symphony. And if verse 3 was coming, Rowan knew one thing for certain. The next body would drop soon. Rowan's tires screeched against the curb as he pulled up in front of Ethan Cole's apartment building, a peeling 3-story brick complex that smelled faintly of mildew and regret. Rain had started to fall again, slicking the streets in oil-sheen reflections, and the neon glow of a laundromat sign across the street pulsed like a failing heartbeat. The unit was on the second floor, end of the hall. Door locked, as before, but this time Rowan wasn't waiting for a warrant. He slid on gloves and picked the lock with practiced precision. The tumblers clicked, and the door swung open with a groan that seemed too loud in the stillness. The first thing that hit him was the smell. Not decay, thank God, but something stale, metallic, like rust and candle wax. Lila stepped in behind him, gun drawn. "Jesus," she muttered. The apartment was sparse. A sagging couch, blinds half closed, dishes stacked in the sink like abandoned promises. But what made Rowan stop cold was the wall. From floor to ceiling, it was papered with pages from hymnals, taped together in overlapping layers. Dozens, maybe hundreds of copies of the same hymn, the Last Amen. Lines circled in red ink. words underlined with angry strokes. And in the center, a single phrase scrawled over and over in black marker. Hear the silence. This guy wasn't just obsessed, Lila whispered. He was consumed. Rowan's gaze dropped to a crate on the floor beneath the wall. Inside were cassette tapes at least 20, all unlabeled except for one. A neat strip of tape across its front read, "My voice." Rowan picked it up, feeling the weight of dread sink deeper. Next to the crate sat a dusty tape recorder plugged in, its red record button smeared faintly with something dark. He pressed play. Static filled the room, then a man's voice low, shaky. Ethan Cole. They said singing was prayer, but the hymn isn't prayer. It's a key. Every note opens the door a little wider. I can hear him when I sing. Price was right. The silence speaks back. A sound followed soft at first, like humming, then louder. A rising chorus of voices that shouldn't exist. Too many to be just Ethan. Lila stiffened. Tell me that's not. Rowan hit stop, his pulse thundering. Before either of them could speak, something clattered in the kitchen, a sharp metallic drop like a spoon hitting tile. Both guns came up instantly. Rowan signaled Lila to flank as he moved forward, muscles coiled tight. The kitchen was empty. Window shut. Door still locked from the inside. But on the counter, resting neatly where it hadn't been seconds ago, was a cassette tape. Not from the crate. A fresh one. Its label read. For the detective, Rowan felt the blood drain from his face. He hadn't seen anyone come in. No one could have slipped past them. And yet the tape was warm. Whoever put it there had just been in this apartment. And they wanted him to listen. The rain had turned to a cold drizzle by the time Rowan reached St. Augustine's again. The sky hung low and gray, the church spire slicing through it like a blackened blade. Every instinct in his body screamed that going back alone was a mistake. But after listening to the tape marked for the detective on the drive over, he didn't have a choice. The voice on the recording was Ethan's again, calmer this time, like a man resigned to something inevitable. Detective Briggs, you're already part of it now. You opened the box. You heard the first note. That means you'll hear the last one too. If you want answers, go to where the water sleeps. Where the water sleeps. The baptistry. Rowan killed the engine and scanned the empty parking lot before stepping into the rain. The church doors loomed ahead, chained loosely with the same yellow crime scene tape, fluttering like dying breath. He slipped under and pushed inside. The silence was heavier than before, oppressive. The air was damp, carrying a coppery tang that made him think of pennies and blood. His boots echoed on the marble floor as he made his way to the small chamber behind the altar, where the baptismal font stood. The door was ajar. A thin line of darkness spilled into the nave. Rowan eased it open and stopped dead. The font was gone. In its place, on the cold stone floor, was a circle of ash, perfectly drawn. Symbols ringed the edges, black and jagged like claw marks burned into the stone. At the center lay something worse. A hymnal, charred to the spine, pages curling like withered petals. And on top of the hymnal, a scrap of parchment with 2 words. Verse 3. Rowan crouched, scanning the markings. The ash wasn't random. It looked deliberate, almost ceremonial. But what made his pulse stutter was the realization that the symbols matched the ones he'd seen on the parchment pulled from the organ loft. Whoever did this wasn't just killing. They were performing something, an ancient ritual disguised as worship. His phone buzzed in his pocket, slicing through the suffocating silence. Unknown number again. He answered without speaking. A voice came through, faint but clear. Male. Calm. Do you hear it, detective? The silence between the notes? That's where he waits. Rowan gripped the phone tight, his knuckles blanching. Ethan? A soft chuckle. Not Ethan. Ethan only opened the door. I'm the one who will walk through it, The line went dead, and then just as the hush pressed in, like a viceroy heard it, a drip, one drop, then another, slow, deliberate. He raised his flashlight, following the sound to the far corner of the baptistry, where a narrow door stood ajar. Water pooled beneath it, streaking the stone black. Rowan's breath hitched. That door led to the old maintenance tunnels under the church, the ones that hadn't been used in decades. He holstered his phone, drew his gun, and pushed the door open. The smell hit him first rot and mildew, sharp enough to burn his throat. His beam cut through the dark, slicing over damp walls and rusted pipes until it landed on something that made his stomach clench. Footprints, bare, leading into the darkness, and scrawled in dripping black letters on the wall above them. Finish the hymn. Rowan took a slow breath, stepped inside, and let the door swing shut behind him. The maintenance tunnels breathed damp air against Rowan's face as he descended the narrow staircase, his flashlight beam cutting through a darkness so thick it felt alive. The sound of water dripping echoed in hollow rhythms, like a broken metronome. Each step deeper pulled him further from the faint safety of the nave and closer to whatever waited in the hush. He stopped at a junction where the tunnel split in two directions. The bare footprints he'd been following trailed left, glistening faintly in his beam. But something else drew his attention first. A faint sound, tinny and distant. Music. He strained to hear. It was coming from his pocket. Rowan's stomach turned cold as he pulled out the small evidence bag containing the second tape, the one labeled "For the Detective." The recorder inside wasn't just humming with static anymore. It was playing, and he hadn't pressed play. He yanked the bag open, heart hammering, and pulled out the recorder. The buttons glowed faintly red as the tape spun. A voice filled the tunnel, distorted but clear enough to send ice racing through his veins. Verse 3 begins in silence. And silence begins in you? Then came the voices. Not one, many, layered like a chorus. Whispering in languages Rowan didn't recognize, sliding under his skin like oil. The sound warped, rising and falling in unnatural cadences, like a hymn sung backward. Rowan's throat tightened as a familiar tone threaded through the cacophony, low at first and undeniable. It was his own voice, repeating a single line over and over. Finish the hymn. Finish the hymn. Rowan staggered back a step, bile burning his throat. No, he muttered, shaking the recorder as if brute force could silence the impossible. The tape clicked, word, and then the whispering stopped. For one long, breathless second, there was nothing. Then a new voice spoke, calm and close enough to make Rowan's skin crawl. Almost there, Detective. Just one more verse. The tape went dead. Rowan's pulse thundered in his ears as he stared at the recorder, the weight of the tunnel pressing in. This wasn't just about Ethan anymore. Someone was inside his head or worse, making sure he became part of their ritual. His phone buzzed. No number. Just a video attachment. He tapped it open, his breath catching when the screen lit up. It was Ethan Cole, sitting cross-legged on the cold stone floor of the baptistry, staring into the camera with hollow eyes. Behind him, that same circle of ash glowed faintly in the dark. He listens when we're quiet, Ethan whispered. But when the hymn ends, he speaks. The camera tilted, revealing something beside Ethan, something that made Rowan's blood freeze. A ledger, old, leather-bound, pages yellowed and curling. Names filled the first two columns in neat black ink. And next to each name, a date. Rowan counted 17 before he stopped breathing. The choir, and below them, a new name scrawled in red ink. Rowan Briggs. Rowan slammed the phone shut and cursed under his breath. Whoever orchestrated this wasn't just predicting the deaths, they were scheduling them. And if the pattern held, his verse was next. From the shadows ahead came a faint sound. A single note, drawn out on what sounded like an organ pipe. Someone was playing down here. Rowan gripped his gun tighter, heart pounding as he followed the footprints into the dark. The hymn wasn't finished yet, but when it was, he'd be in the silence too. The tunnel sloped downward into a cavern where the air grew heavier, tasting of ash and mildew. Rowan's boots sank slightly into damp earth as the beam of his flashlight swept across rough stone walls. The faint note he'd heard earlier lingered like a ghost in his ears, but now it was joined by something worse breathing. Not steady, ragged, as if more than one person lurked just beyond the edge of the light. Rowan slowed his steps, gun steady in one hand, the flashlight in the other. The footprints he'd been following stopped abruptly at an archway carved into the stone. Strange symbols marred the frame, deep gouges that looked less carved than clawed. He stepped through and froze. The chamber beyond looked like a chapel for the damned. A circle of chairs filled the center of the space, 17 wooden seats, arranged in perfect symmetry. Each chair bore a white robe draped across it, clean despite the filth around them. Hymnals rested neatly on every seat, open to hymn 237, the last Amen. And at the far end of the circle stood an altar of black stone, rough and glistening like wet obsidian. Behind it, an old pipe organ rose like a skeletal beast, its pipes twisted, some bent at unnatural angles as if they'd grown from the rock itself. But what made Rowan's stomach clench was the 18th chair, set apart, facing the altar. On its backrest, scrawled in dripping black ink, was his name, Rowan Briggs. The hush in the chamber pressed against his ears until he swore he could hear his own blood roaring. He circled the room cautiously, eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. No sign of Ethan. No sign of the voice that had taunted him. Then his beam hit something behind the altar, a book, propped open on a wooden stand. Its pages were yellowed, ink faded except for the heading. The last Amen, the rite of silence. Symbols crawled across the parchment like vines. Marginal notes, some in Latin, others in English, spoke of sacrifice, silence, and something Rowan wished he hadn't read. To invite the presence, all voices must end. One remains to bear the hymn to its close. His breath shall be the key. One remains. Rowan's pulse thudded in his skull as he backed away. That's when the organ came alive. A single note thundered through the cavern, deep enough to make the ground tremble. Rowan spun, flashlight jerking toward the pipes. No one sat at the keys. But the music built anyway, slow and relentless, chords swelling like a tide. Dust rained from the ceiling as the sound rose, filling the chamber with a hymn that didn't belong to any church Rowan had ever known. He clamped his hands over his ears, but it didn't matter. The notes were inside him, crawling through his bones, shaking his teeth. His vision blurred, the shadows bending, the circle of chairs seeming to sway like dancers in a silent waltz. A shape moved then, just beyond the altar. Tall, hooded, black as the stone it stood against. It raised a hand, and the music stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. Then, in that dead hush, a voice slithered through the dark smooth, calm, almost tender. The final verse begins at midnight, Detective, and you already know the melody. Rowan's throat dried as he raised his gun, but the figure was gone. Only the chairs remained, waiting. And above him, carved into the stone ceiling in letters so deep they seemed to bleed shadow, was a single phrase. Amen is the door. Rowan backed toward the tunnel, his breath ragged, phone buzzing in his pocket with another message he didn't need to read to know what it said. Midnight was coming, and when the last note fell, so would he. The hum of silence in that underground chamber clung to Rowan's skin long after he stumbled out of the tunnels and into the sanctuary above. His lungs burned as if he'd sprinted a marathon, though all he'd done was climb. Midnight was 2 hours away. 2 hours until the final verse. Rowan stood at the altar of St. Augustine's, trying to steady his breath. His phone buzzed again in his pocket. Another message from the unknown number. He didn't look this time. He couldn't. The figure in the chamber of the chairs, the robe with his name, burned in his mind like a brand. And the phrase carved into stone, Amen is the door. If Amen was the door, what happened when the hymn ended? He turned back to the baptistry door, eyes catching on the symbols scorched into the floor earlier. Circles, crosses, sigils he still didn't understand. But all of it pointed to one thing, a ritual older than this church, older than any choir hymn book. And it wasn't over. Lila's voice snapped through his haze as she burst through the church doors, rain dripping from her hair. "Rowan," she called, striding up the aisle, holding something wrapped in a clear evidence bag. It was a book. Not just any book, the ledger from the video Ethan had sent. "Where the hell did you find that?" Rowan demanded. "In Ethan's storage unit," she said, breathless. "Tucked inside a locked trunk with more hymnals, and—" She hesitated, her expression tightening. "And bones, Rowan. Human bones." He clenched his jaw as she handed him the ledger. The cover was cracked leather, blackened at the edges. Inside, names filled the pages in neat, slanted handwriting. 17 names. All the choir victims. Each paired with a date the day they died. But what made Rowan's blood run cold was the 18th entry, written in red ink. Rowan Briggs. Date: today. His hand shook as he turned the page and froze. There was another line, blank except for a header. Witness. Beneath it, no name, no date, just an empty line waiting to be filled. "What the hell does that mean?" Lila whispered, peering over his shoulder. Rowan flipped back to the first page, scanning the columns again, and that's when he saw it. The handwriting changed halfway through. The original names had been written in black ink, careful, controlled, but the last 5? Sloppier. The letters leaned forward, jagged like someone writing fast. Or desperate. Rowan felt the pieces slant together. "Ethan didn't start this," he said hoarsely. "He finished it." Lila frowned. "Then who?" Before she could finish, the church erupted with sound. The organ. It boomed from nowhere, deep and discordant, shaking the pews as a rush of freezing air swept through the nave. Rowan spun toward the loft, heart hammering, but the bench was empty, just like before. The hymn roared down from the pipes, a grotesque melody twisting the walls with every note. Lights flickered. The stained glass vibrated in its frames, and Rowan's phone buzzed again. This time, he looked. A video feed flickered across his screen. The underground chamber. All 18 chairs now occupied, every single choir victim sitting upright in their white robes. And in the 18th chair, his name painted in black ink. Empty. Waiting. The camera panned to the altar, where a hand entered the frame and laid the ledger open like scripture. Then the hooded figure leaned into view, mask pale and smooth as bone. It raised one finger slowly, as if conducting an unseen orchestra. And the message below the video burned into Rowan's brain. 2 verses down, Detective. 1 to go. Midnight Mass begins now. The screen went black. And then, from deep below the church, a voice began to sing. The organ's relentless chords reverberated through the nave like a war drum for the damned. Rowan bolted toward the stairs leading to the loft, gun raised, breath sharp. But the bench was empty again. The pipes played on their own, monstrous and alive, as if the church itself had become the instrument. Below, Lila's voice cut through the cacophony. "Rowan, stop!" He spun, flashlight slicing through the stained glass glow, to where she stood by the altar, phone pressed to her ear, face pale as wax. "It's Walker!" she shouted over the din. From audio, the first tape? It wasn't just Ethan's voice. "Rowan, it was yours. From the beginning." "I know." Rowan roared back, pointing toward the tunnel door behind the baptistry. That's where they are. The Mass is starting. We don't have time. But Lila didn't move. She lowered her phone slowly, her other hand hovering near her hip, too close to her weapon. Rowan, she said softly, her tone wrong, too calm. You've been listening, haven't you? Really listening? His pulse hammered in his ears. What the hell are you talking about? She stepped closer, boots clicking against the marble in time with the organ's pounding notes. The silence, she murmured. It's beautiful, isn't it? That stillness between the notes. That's where he lives. And when you heard it. Her lips curved in something almost tender. You opened the door. Rowan's stomach turned to ice. No, he whispered. Yes. Lila's smile widened, sharp as broken glass. Ethan was weak. He believed he could lead the verse alone. But he wanted someone stronger, someone who knows the sound of death better than anyone. A detective. A man who lives in the silence every day. She drew her gun, not to fire, but to lay it gently on the altar, like an offering. The organ boomed louder, vibrating through Rowan's bones. You are never investigating this, Lila said, stepping close enough for him to see the shimmer in her eyes. Not madness, devotion. You were preparing for it. Preparing for what? He growled, teeth clenched. The last amen, she whispered. Before Rowan could react, something cracked against the back of his skull. Pain exploded in white sparks as the floor rushed up to meet him. Darkness swallowed the nave. When he came to, his hands were bound to the arms of a wooden chair. The air was damp and stifling, a sound of water dripping echoing through the stone chamber. He didn't need to open his eyes to know where he was. The underground circle. He forced his lids open, heart pounding like a war drum as his vision adjusted. The chairs were filled now, all 17 victims sitting in their white robes, heads bowed, hymnals open in skeletal hands. And in the 18th chair, the one with his name sat him. Rowan tugged against the ropes biting into his wrists, but the knots were tight, cutting deep. Across the circle stood the altar, the ledger spread open like a Bible. Lila stood beside it, hood down, her black eyes locked on his. You'll finish the hymn, Rowan, she said softly, as the hooded figure stepped out of the shadows behind her. You'll open the door. The organ thundered above, shaking the chamber as the hymn began to rise again, notes curling through the dark like smoke, twisting into something that didn't sound human anymore. And over it all, a low voice spoke from the hooded figure, echoing like a hollow grave. Verse 3 begins now. The circle of robed corpses lifted their heads in perfect unison. And then they started to sing. The hymn rose like a tide of rot and whispers, filling the underground chamber with a sound that didn't belong to the living. It was harmony and horror braided together, 17 voices vibrating through the marrow of the earth, mouths slack but moving in perfect, inhuman rhythm. Rowan strained against the ropes cutting into his wrists, the wood of the chair biting into his spine. The circle of corpses swayed slightly as they sang, robes brushing the stone floor like ghostly waves. And in the center, by the black altar, Lila watched him serene, almost radiant, her face glowing in the flicker of candlelight. You were chosen, Rowan, she said softly, her voice like a lullaby beneath the cacophony. Every death you've carried, every silence you've stood in it, led you here, to open the door. Go to hell, Rowan hissed, his throat raw. A hooded figure stepped forward, moving with slow, dreadful grace. The masked bone white, featureless tilted toward him. Its voice came low, smooth as oil. There is no hell. There is only the hush. The figure lifted something from the altar. A blade, thin and curved, its edge blackened with age. Symbols crawled along its length like veins. Lila leaned closer to Rowan, her whisper brushing his ear like a serpent's tongue. When you say the last word, she murmured, he will come, and we will not hear death. We will hear perfection. The ropes tightened suddenly, yanking his arms forward. Invisible hands? No hands from the chairs. The dead were moving, skeletal fingers coiling around his wrists and ankles with unnatural strength. Their mouths kept singing, hollow throats pouring out soundless breath that somehow shattered the air. Rowan's mind screamed for a way out. Gun gone, knife too far. But then his eyes landed on the ledger lying open on the altar, its pages rippling under the hymn's vibrations. The names, the dates, and the blank line beneath witness. Not written yet. Not inevitable. Rowan gritted his teeth, forcing his voice through the crushing weight of sound. You need me to finish the hymn, he rasped. Without me, the door stays shut. The hooded figure tilted its head slowly, as if amused. Yes, it said. Rowan took a breath that scraped his lungs raw. Then listen closely. And he screamed not words, but a raw, guttural sound that ripped through the chamber like lightning. It wasn't the hymn. It wasn't anything holy. It was defiance, violence, every death he'd ever carried surging from his throat. The corpses jerked violently, their heads snapping back as the melody fractured. The organ above groaned in protest, pipes shuddering until one split with a shriek of torn metal. Candles guttered, flames spitting sparks into the dark. The hooded figure lunged, the blade slashing downward. Rowan wrenched his chair sideways, ropes tearing against splintering wood. Pain tore his wrists as he twisted free, grabbing the altar with blood-slick hands. The ledger slid, pages tearing as it hit the floor. He snatched a candle, its flames spitting wax onto his skin, and hurled it at the book. Oil from the altar spilled with it, catching fire in a whoosh of black smoke. The ledger ignited, and the hymn screamed, not the voices, the hymn itself. The notes warped into shrieks as the fire raced across the pages, consuming names written in ink and blood. The corpses convulsed, jaws unhinging in a silent howl as smoke poured from their mouths. Lila shrieked, lunging toward the flames, but Rowan slammed his shoulder into her, knocking her backward into the circle. She hit the stone hard, eyes wide in something that looked almost like betrayal. The hooded figure roared an inhuman sound and plunged toward the altar, arms outstretched as the fire devoured the last page. The mask cracked, fissures glowing red beneath, as if something inside was burning alive. Rowan grabbed the curved blade and drove it into the altar's heart. The stone split like rotten bone. Light blinding, searing erupted from the fissure, swallowing the chamber in a scream of white. Heat tore the air as Rowan threw himself to the ground, arms shielding his face while the hymn shattered into silence. Then, nothing. When Rowan opened his eyes, the chamber was gone. He lay on the cold floor of the nave, the ceiling of St. Augustine's arching above him like a hollow sky. The candles were burned out, the organ pipes stood twisted and blackened, and around him, nothing but ash, a circle of gray where the chairs had been. No Lila, no hooded figure, only silence. Rowan staggered to his feet, the taste of smoke bitter on his tongue. His wrists were raw, his clothes scorched, but he was alive. He stared at the altar. The ledger was gone, consumed to nothing, and for a long time there was only quiet, until his phone buzzed. One message from unknown. Doors never stay closed, detective. See you for the next verse. The church bells began to toll midnight, and Rowan knew the hymn wasn't finished. What you just heard wasn't the full story. It was the part someone tried to bury, the part that didn't fit the headline, the part where a person, not a suspect, was lost in the process. This case showed us what happens when the system moves too fast, or not at all, when suspicion weighs more than truth, when justice shows up late or never. But here's the thing. If these stories don't leave us asking questions, they'll keep repeating with different names. So if this one meant something to you, don't just move on. Talk about it. question it, pass it on, because silence protects the wrong side of history. And sometimes the only thing standing between truth and erasure is someone who chooses to care. Like, share, comment. Let the next chapter begin with awareness, not regret.